I used to think that drowning happened all at once, a violent thrashing against waves before surrender. Now I know better. Real drowning is quiet, gradual, a slow sinking while you convince yourself you're still swimming. My name is Melissa. 6 months ago, I had a husband who loved me, a network of friends who respected me, and a life I'd carefully built over 15 years. Now I have an empty house, a divorce attorney's business card in my wallet, and the crushing weight of knowing it was all my choice. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Rain-slicked roads, a deer my car wrapped around a tree. I remember the taste of blood and airbag dust, the crunch of glass beneath the paramedic's boots, Brian's face, my husband's face, pale and terrified in the hospital waiting room. 3 cracked ribs, a fractured collarbone, whiplash that left me unable to turn my head for weeks. The doctor called me lucky. Brian took 2 weeks off work to care for me, sleeping on the couch because our bed hurt my injuries. He made soup I couldn't taste, refilled prescriptions, helped me shower without looking at my body. Then the medical bills started arriving. "I'll pick up extra shifts," he said one night, shoulders hunched over our kitchen table, calculator in hand. "We'll get through this." That's when the drowning began, so slight I didn't notice the water rising. The recovery group met in a church basement on Thursday evenings. Brian suggested it after I spent 3 days crying from pain and frustration. "You need people who understand what you're going through," he said, already dressed in his security uniform for another overnight shift. "I'm trying, Mel, but I don't know how to help you." The circle of folding chairs held 8 people with broken bodies and fractured lives. Car accidents, workplace injuries, 1 woman recovering from domestic violence. And Derek, 42, architect, T-bone collision at an intersection 4 months earlier. Dark circles under green eyes. A cane he leaned on with quiet dignity. "The physical pain is nothing compared to feeling useless," he said during my first meeting, words that crystallized everything I couldn't explain to Brian. My wife tries to understand, but how could she? After the meeting, Derek offered me his phone number. "Recovery partners," he explained. "Someone to text when the pain is bad at 3 a.m. and you don't want to wake your family." I took his number and told myself it was just support, just understanding, just someone who knew what it felt like when your body betrayed you. The first text I sent at midnight: "Can't sleep, pains at an 8 tonight." His reply came instantly: "I'm awake too, what helps on your bad nights?" And just like that, I felt like I could breathe again, just a little, just enough. Brian left for work before I woke and returned after I fell asleep. The extra shifts were piling up, a mountain of hours to pay for the accident that was my fault. 1,000 tiny resentments began floating in the space between us: his exhaustion, my dependency, the way he flinched when I gasped in pain. "I miss you," I said one Sunday morning, our only overlapping hours. "I'm right here," he answered, already dozing on the couch, the television murmuring infomercials neither of us watched. But he wasn't there, not really, and I was drowning in the loneliness of sharing space with someone who had become a stranger. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with messages from Derek: book recommendations for long, pain-filled nights, links to meditation videos that helped with muscle spasms, questions about my life before, my hopes for after. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" I texted one evening while Brian worked. "Maybe we find a new normal," Derek replied. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." I stayed up until 2 a.m. texting Derek about all the things I couldn't say to my husband. How I hated being a burden. How the pain medications made me feel simultaneously numb and raw. How I missed feeling desirable, capable, strong. Recovery partners, I still called it, a lifeline in a drowning sea. The first lie came 3 weeks later. "Support group tonight," I told Brian as he readied for work. "That's great," he said, genuine relief in his voice. "It seems to be helping." I nodded, not mentioning that Thursday meetings had moved to Wednesdays, that I was actually meeting Derek for coffee, just coffee, to discuss a new physical therapist he'd found. The lie slipped out so easily it barely felt like deception, just an omission, just a small detail not worth explaining. Derek's apartment had wide windows overlooking the river. Clean lines, minimal furniture, books arranged by color on industrial shelving. He walked with his cane to the kitchen, movements measured but graceful despite his lingering injuries. "Tea," he offered, gesturing to a chair where I could see the water. I sat, noticing how the afternoon light turned the river to gold. My own home had started feeling like a cage, blinds drawn against migraines, dishes piled in the sink, the ghost of my marriage haunting every room. "It's peaceful here," I said. "I redesigned everything after the accident," Derek explained. "Needed to control something when my body wouldn't cooperate." We talked for hours that afternoon, about grief, not just for people, but for versions of ourselves now gone, about the frustration of healing at a pace that never feels fast enough, about the isolation of pain others cannot see. When he touched my hand, I told myself it was comfort between friends. When he brushed hair from my face, I told myself it was kindness. When I leaned toward him, I told myself it was gratitude. The kiss happened somewhere between my second cup of tea and sunset. Gentle at first, then hungry with the need to feel something other than pain. His hands were careful around my still healing body, finding places that didn't hurt. "We shouldn't," I whispered against his mouth, not pulling away. "I know," he agreed, not stopping. We didn't sleep together that day, but another line had been crossed. Another level of water rising around me while I pretended I wasn't drowning. The lies grew more elaborate. Physical therapy appointments that didn't exist. Recovery group meetings that ran long. Once, an overnight retreat for accident survivors that was actually 18 hours in Derek's bed, learning the language of his body while my phone sat silenced in my purse. Each deception came easier than the last. I created a second email account for confirmations Derek sent for our meetings, deleted texts as soon as they arrived, kept a journal of fictional therapy exercises in case Brian asked about my progress. I became someone I didn't recognize, calculating, secretive, capable of looking into my husband's exhausted face and lying without hesitation. "How was your day?" Brian would ask, barely awake enough to hear the answer. "Same as always," I'd reply. "How was work?" We performed the rituals of marriage without the substance. Two actors reciting lines without emotion. Meanwhile, I was building a parallel life with Derek, one where my broken body wasn't a burden but a map to be explored, where my fears were met with understanding instead of tired resignation. "You're different with me," Derek said once, tracing circles on my bare shoulder. "More alive." I didn't tell him that feeling alive with him meant becoming dead inside at home, that each moment of passion came with hours of guilt afterward, that sometimes I caught glimpses of myself in mirrors and didn't recognize the woman looking back. Because the truth was, I liked who I was with Derek, liked the version of myself who wasn't defined by injury and dependency, liked feeling desired instead of pitied. So the water rose higher, and I kept pretending I could still touch bottom. The first crack appeared when Brian found pain medication in my purse that I'd told him I'd stopped taking weeks ago. "I thought you were getting better," he said, hurt and confusion in his voice. "Why are you still taking these?" "Just on bad days," I lied, knowing I'd actually been saving them for mornings after nights with Derek. When my body ached from activities my husband believed I was still too fragile to attempt. Brian studied my face for too long. "You seem different lately." "I'm healing," I said, the partial truth more painful than a complete lie. But Brian's suspicion had been awakened. He started calling during support group meetings, asking specific questions about topics discussed, suggested accompanying me to physical therapy for moral support. Once, he came home unexpectedly during a time I told him I was meeting with the insurance adjuster. Fortunately, I actually was home, texting Derek about plans for the following day. "You're checking up on me," I accused after the third surprise appearance. "Should I need to?" Brian asked, and I couldn't meet his eyes. Derek noticed the change too. "You're distracted," he said during one of our afternoons together. "Is everything okay at home?" "Brian's working less," I explained. "The medical bills are mostly covered now." "And that's bad," Derek raised an eyebrow. I didn't answer because I didn't know how to explain that my husband's renewed presence felt like an intrusion, that I'd grown comfortable in the dual life I'd created, that I resented having to be more careful with my deceptions. The second crack came when Sarah from Recovery Group saw Brian and me at the grocery store. "Melissa," she called, wheeling her cart toward us. "Nice to finally meet your husband. Derek talks about both of you so much." Brian's hand tightened around mine. Derek. From group, I said quickly. He's our facilitator. Sarah looked confused but didn't contradict me. I changed the subject, made excuses to leave, spent the entire drive home explaining that Derek was just an important part of the support system, nothing more. You've never mentioned him before, Brian said, voice carefully neutral. Haven't I? I kept my eyes on the road. It never seemed important. Another lie, another foot of water above my head. I should have ended it then, should have recognized the warning signs, should have chosen my marriage over the intoxication of being wanted. Instead, I became more reckless. Derek and I met more frequently, took fewer precautions. Once had lunch at a restaurant only blocks from Brian's workplace. I convinced myself that the close calls added excitement rather than danger. We should go away somewhere, Derek suggested one afternoon. A weekend, no interruptions. The idea thrilled and terrified me. I can't disappear for a weekend without explanation. Tell him it's a recovery retreat. They have those, you know. So I did, invented a mountain wellness center with programs specifically for accident survivors, created a fake website confirmation email to show Brian, packed modest, unassuming clothes while hiding lingerie underneath. Are you sure you'll be okay on your own? Brian asked the morning I was leaving, concern etched into the lines of his face. It's a good program, I assured him. Everyone says it helps tremendously. He hugged me goodbye, his body warm and familiar against mine. For a brief moment, I almost confessed everything, almost canceled the weekend, almost chose to stay. Then I remembered how Derek looked at me, not as damaged goods but as something precious and desired, and I pulled away. I'll call when I get there, I promised, another lie to join the others. Derek had booked a cabin by a lake 2 hours from the city, all wood and glass, with a deck overlooking water that reflected the sky. We arrived Friday afternoon, and for a few hours, I allowed myself to forget everything but the feel of his hands, the taste of his skin, the release of being fully myself without pretense. Afterward, lying in tangled sheets, I finally asked the question I'd been avoiding. What happens when we're both fully recovered? Derek traced patterns on my stomach. What do you mean? This started because we understood each other's pain. What happens when the pain is gone? He didn't answer immediately, and something cold settled in my chest. I care about you, he said finally. That won't change just because we're better. But there was hesitation in his voice, a barely perceptible pause that whispered of uncertainty. Would you ever leave your wife? I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. Derek sat up, reaching for his cane, leaning against the nightstand. That's complicated, Melissa. We have history, finances, families intertwined. So do Brian and I pointed out. It's different, he insisted, limping toward the bathroom. How? I called after him. He didn't answer, and I lay there listening to the water run, understanding slowly dawning. Derek had no intention of restructuring his life for me. Our relationship existed in a bubble outside reality, a temporary escape, not a new beginning. I checked my phone for the first time since arriving. 3 missed calls from Brian, 1 voicemail. Hey Mel, just checking you got there safe. The retreat center number you gave me isn't working. Call when you can. Panic rose in my throat. I'd made up the center, created a fake number I thought he wouldn't call. Now he was worried, probably calling hospitals, maybe even driving to the fictitious location I'd provided. I was fumbling to return his call when a text message appeared. I know you're not at any retreat. I followed you today. How could you do this to us? The phone slipped from my hand. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The water was closing over my head, and there was no surface to reach anymore. What followed was chaos in slow motion. Brian had indeed followed me, watched me pick up Derek, saw us kiss at a gas station, tracked us to the cabin. He didn't confront us there. Instead, he'd driven home, packed a bag, and gone to his brother's house. His text was sent hours after discovering the truth. I called him 17 times that night. He answered once. Brian, please, I can explain. Explain what? His voice was flat, emotionless. How long you've been fucking your support group friend? How many times you've lied to my face while I worked double shifts to pay for your medical bills? It's not like that. I spoke to Sarah, he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. She was very confused about why I didn't know about your recovery partner. Apparently the whole group knows about you too. Shame burned through me. I'm coming home, we need to talk. Don't bother, I won't be there. He hung up. Derek found me crying on the cabin floor, phone clutched to my chest. What happened? He asked, kneeling awkwardly with his bad leg. I told him through broken sobs. Expected comfort, support, reassurance that we'd figure it out together. Instead, he pulled away. You said he wouldn't find out. What? Melissa, I can't. He ran a hand through his hair. My wife can't know about this, we have children. The world tilted sideways. Children, you never mentioned children. It never seemed relevant. He echoed my own words back to me. You let me risk my marriage and you have children at home? My voice rose with each word. What was this to you? Just a distraction while you recovered. His silence was answer enough. I left that night driving through darkness with tears blurring the road ahead. Called Brian repeatedly until he blocked my number. Texted until I hit the character limit. Finally ended up parked outside our house. My house now, I supposed, at 3 in the morning, alone with the wreckage of my choices. The aftermath was brutal in its totality. Brian filed for separation the following week, moved in permanently with his brother, refused all contact except through our respective lawyers. The support group fractured when the truth emerged. Some sided with me, others with Derek. Sarah stopped coming altogether, unwilling to be caught in the drama. The safe space I'd relied on dissolved overnight. Derek's wife called me once. Didn't yell or threaten, just asked in a voice heavy with dignity, was it worth destroying 2 families? I had no answer that didn't sound like an excuse. Derek himself retreated completely. Blocked my number, my email, changed his appointments to avoid any possibility of running into me. Our passionate connection, our deep understanding, both revealed as illusions built on shared trauma and mutual deception. Weeks passed, then months. I healed physically while deteriorating in every other way. Started physical therapy again, legitimate this time, with a provider across town who knew nothing of my personal disaster. Friends chose sides, most chose Brian's. Even my sister, upon learning the full story, told me she needed some time before we could speak again. You broke the one person who stood by you, she said before hanging up. I don't even recognize you anymore. I didn't recognize myself either. The woman who had systematically lied, cheated, manipulated, she was a stranger wearing my face, making choices I couldn't comprehend in retrospect. 6 months after the accident that started everything, I signed the final divorce papers. Brian didn't attend the proceeding, his signature already on the documents. He'd been more than fair in the settlement, asking only that I acknowledge my infidelity as the cause of dissolution. He wants it on record, his lawyer explained, that's all. So now it exists in court documents, the permanent record of my failure. Not the accident that broke my body, but the choices that broke everything else. I ran into Derek once 3 weeks ago, at a coffee shop across town where I'd gone specifically to avoid familiar faces. He was with a woman and 2 young boys, his family, I presumed. He saw me, froze for a moment, then guided his wife and children quickly out the door. It was the final confirmation that what we'd shared had meant nothing beyond temporary escape, that I'd sacrificed everything for someone who wouldn't even meet my eyes in public. People talk about rock bottom like it's a place you hit suddenly, violently, a dramatic crash followed by the clear realization that you must climb upward. But that's not how it works. Rock bottom is quiet. It's sitting alone in a house that echoes with absence. It's realizing there's no one to call when pain keeps you awake at night. It's understanding, too late, the value of what you carelessly destroyed. I don't expect forgiveness from Brian. Don't deserve it. The look on his face when he finally agreed to meet me, just once for closure, told me everything. Not hatred or anger, which might have been easier to bear, just profound disappointment and a sadness so deep it had transformed him. Were you ever going to tell me if I hadn't found out? He asked. I don't know, I answered honestly, the last truth between us. He nodded, as if that confirmed something he already knew. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Mel. But that's the heaviest truth of all. I wasn't looking for anything when this began, wasn't trying to escape a bad marriage or find a great love. Just gradually allowed myself to sink beneath the surface of my life, mistaking drowning for swimming until it was too late to tell the difference. Now I'm left with the weight of water in my lungs and the knowledge that I did this to myself. No one pushed me under. No current dragged me down. I chose each step that led me here to this empty house and emptier future. They say you can rebuild after hitting bottom, start over, find redemption. Maybe someday. But for now, I'm still learning how to breathe again in a world where everything familiar has been washed away. Still reckoning with the person I became when I thought no one was watching. Still understanding that the greatest pain isn't what happens to you, but what you choose to do to others. And living with that understanding is a burden heavier than any broken bone.